The moment you feel the need to explain yourself, something subtle shifts. Not in the room, inside you. Your voice slows down. Your posture softens. Your words start reaching instead of landing. You're no longer speaking to express reality. You're speaking to manage perception. That single shift is never neutral. It broadcasts something before your sentence even finishes. Not weakness. Something worse. Predictability. People don't consciously register it. They feel it. And once they feel it, the dynamic is already tilted. No argument needed. No confrontation required. The hierarchy adjusts on its own. If you've felt this happen before, stay. You don't need this explained. You need it named. You were never losing power in loud moments. You weren't overpowered in arguments or outmaneuvered in confrontation. Those are visible losses, obvious ones. What shifted things against you happened much earlier, much quieter, and far more consistently. Power doesn't disappear when someone challenges you. It disappears when you rush to remove tension, when you clarify too fast, when you correct assumptions that were never voiced, when you try to be understood before you're respected. That behavior feels harmless because it wears the mask of intelligence. It feels mature, reasonable, even strategic. But socially, it functions like an open ledger. Every explanation reveals position. Every justification signals concern. Every clarification confirms investment. And power never invests downward. Most people misunderstand hierarchy because they think it's built through dominance. It isn't. Hierarchy is built through information control. Who speaks first? Who explains? Who fills silence? Who feels responsible for comfort? The moment you start managing how others perceive you, you've already accepted a lower role. Not because you were wrong, but because you volunteered to make yourself legible. Legibility is safety for others. Opacity is power. This is why power dynamics rarely flip during conflict. They flip in the moments surrounding it. Before words escalate, before tone sharpens, before anyone openly disagrees. They flip when one person feels the urge to smooth things out and the other doesn't. Socially, the person who tolerates ambiguity longer controls the frame. They don't rush to be liked. They don't rush to be cleared of suspicion. They don't rush to correct narratives forming in someone else's head. They let those narratives exist. That restraint is misread as calm, but what it actually communicates is non-need. And non-need is the most reliable indicator of higher position. This is where most people break the dynamic without realizing it. They assume misunderstanding is dangerous. They assume silence creates loss. They assume clarity restores balance. It doesn't. Clarity restores comfort, not authority. When you explain yourself, you're not equalizing the exchange. You're signaling that the other person's interpretation has leverage over you, that their approval, agreement, or comprehension matters enough to correct. That signal doesn't provoke resistance. It invites testing. Testing doesn't look aggressive at first. It looks casual. Questions framed as curiosity. Remarks delivered as jokes. Assumptions slipped into conversation without challenge. Each test asks the same question. Will you step forward to manage this, or will you let it sit? Every time you step forward, you answer it. This is why power shifts feel mysterious to people who lose them. They don't remember a single moment where they gave up ground, because they didn't. They explained it away, piece by piece. The dynamic didn't flip because someone took something from you. It flipped because you kept offering access. There's a reason observers of power never focus on what strong figures do more of. They focus on what they refuse to do at all, what they never rush into, what they never correct, what they allow others to sit with. This isn't about silence as a tactic. It's about silence as a position. The higher someone sits in a hierarchy, the less they feel compelled to close loops for others. They don't chase clarity. They don't rush resolution. They don't fix discomfort they didn't create. They let uncertainty linger because uncertainty forces adjustment, just not from them. Most people reverse this instinct. They treat discomfort as a problem to solve. They treat tension as a mistake. They treat misinterpretation as a threat. So they speak and explain and justify and slowly teach others exactly where the leverage points are. This is why power dynamics flip instantly when they flip at all. Not because a dramatic move was made, but because a long pattern quietly stopped. And that pattern always looks the same. The moment you stop needing to be understood, the need to control you disappears. You don't announce this shift. You don't perform it. You don't weaponize it. You simply stop repairing frames that don't serve you. That's not withdrawal. It's elevation. And it's the first thing every serious observer of power notices, including Niccolò Machiavelli. Not as advice, as a pattern. Power doesn't argue its position. It occupies it. And once you see that, you can't unsee what's been costing you leverage all along. The reason this works so consistently is because it doesn't feel like power when you're doing it. It feels like restraint, like maturity, like choosing not to waste energy. That's why most people miss it. They assume power must look active, decisive, assertive, visible. They look for a move, a line, a tactic they can deploy in the moment tension appears. But the flip never happens at the moment of tension. It happens before anyone realizes there was a contest at all. What most people call a power move is usually compensation. It's an attempt to reclaim something that already slipped, a late correction, a loud response to a quiet loss. The actual shift is subtractive. It's not about doing more. It's about no longer performing a specific behavior that trained others how to treat you. The trick is simple enough to sound insulting once you see it. You stop clarifying your position when it hasn't been challenged. You stop preemptively defending intentions no one accused you of. You stop answering questions that were never directly asked. Not as an act of defiance, as an act of non-participation. This changes the geometry of the interaction immediately. Because the moment you don't rush to explain, the burden shifts. Silence stops being something you manage. It becomes something the other person must interpret. And interpretation is work. Whoever is working harder to resolve the interaction is not in control of it. They're reacting to it. They're inside someone else's frame, even if the tone stays polite. The instant you stop volunteering clarity, you force a recalibration. Not through intimidation, through absence. People don't know what to do with withheld access. They're used to being handed meaning. They're trained by years of social conditioning to expect emotional subtitles, verbal disclaimers, context on demand. When those things don't arrive, something subtle happens. They pause. They adjust. They start measuring instead of assuming. That pause is the flip. It doesn't look dramatic. No one acknowledges it. Nothing is said out loud, but the next interaction changes tone. Questions become more careful. Assertions soften. Testing decreases. Not because you became dominant, but because you became unreadable. Readability is what invites control. Unpredictability is what restores balance. This is where people sabotage the shift without realizing it. They feel the pause. They sense the recalibration beginning. And then they rush to fill it. They laugh. They soften. They clarify. They overcorrect. They mistake the discomfort for danger. But discomfort is the mechanism. It's the system adjusting around a missing behavior. You don't need to act colder. You don't need to withdraw socially. You don't need to perform indifference. Those are still actions, and actions are still signals. What changes everything is the refusal to manage interpretations that don't threaten your position. High-status behavior is often misdescribed as confidence, but confidence still seeks confirmation. It still wants alignment. What actually flips dynamics is non-attachment to being read correctly. When you don't rush to be understood, you communicate that misunderstanding doesn't harm you. And if it doesn't harm you, it doesn't empower anyone else. This is why attempts to imitate power usually fail. People copy surface behaviors, silence, brevity, bluntness, without removing the internal urge that drives explanation. So the silence feels tense, the brevity feels forced, the bluntness feels reactive, and others sense that immediately. The trick only works when it's not used as a trick. When it's the natural result of no longer needing validation through clarity. You don't withhold information to manipulate. You simply stop distributing it to stabilize the room. That's the line most people never cross, because stabilizing the room feels responsible. It feels like leadership. It feels like control. But in social hierarchies, the one who stabilizes absorbs the pressure. And the one who absorbs pressure is not at the top of the structure. The top doesn't regulate emotional weather. It waits for the system to regulate itself. Once you see this, you'll notice how often power is offered away voluntarily. In meetings, in relationships, in negotiations, in casual conversations that quietly establish rank. Not through submission, through over-clarity. And once you stop doing that one thing, the dynamic doesn't fight you. It rearranges around you. No confrontation, no announcement, no visible assertion, just a shift in who feels responsible for making things make sense. That's why this flip feels instant when it finally happens, because nothing new was added. Something old was removed. And the moment it's gone, the structure exposes itself. At some point, this stops feeling like a technique and starts feeling like a boundary you didn't know you were allowed to have. Not a boundary you announce, not one you defend, one that exists simply because you no longer step past it for others. That's where the shift becomes irreversible. Until then, most people hover in a transitional state. They practice restraint situationally. They hold back in some moments, then overcorrect in others. They test silence, then retreat from it when the room feels unstable. That inconsistency is what keeps the hierarchy fluid. It tells others you're experimenting, not positioned. And experiments invite pressure. The permanent shift happens when you internalize a single rule and stop negotiating with it internally. A rule that isn't moral, isn't polite, isn't designed to improve communication. It's designed to protect position. The rule is simple, but it cuts against every social instinct you've been trained into. You do not explain yourself unless there is a direct cost to not being understood. Not discomfort, not awkwardness, not tension. Cost. Most people respond to potential misunderstanding as if it's automatically expensive. They treat it like a threat to reputation, connection, or safety. So they rush to neutralize it. But in doing so, they invert the hierarchy. They assume responsibility for how others process them. That assumption is the cost. When you remove it, something else happens instead. Others begin to take responsibility for their interpretations. They become more careful with assumptions, more deliberate with challenges, more precise with questions, because now access isn't guaranteed. This is the part that feels counterintuitive even after you understand it intellectually. You expect withholding explanation to create distance, coldness, disconnection. But what it actually creates is gravity. People move toward what isn't fully available, not out of desire, out of orientation. They want to know where they stand. And when you're not supplying that answer immediately, the burden shifts. They adjust tone. They reevaluate posture. They reconsider how far they can lean. This is why the rule must be internal, not performative. If you're consciously holding back, others feel it. If you're resisting the urge to explain, tension leaks through your body language. The rule only works when the urge disappears. That happens when you stop tying your sense of stability to external clarity. Once that link is broken, silence stops feeling like exposure. It starts feeling neutral, almost boring. And boredom is powerful, because when you're not internally activated by ambiguity, you don't rush to resolve it. You let it exist without narrating yourself through it. That's the moment interactions begin to rebalance on their own. You'll notice it first in small ways. People start phrasing things more carefully around you. They ask instead of assume. They pause where they used to push, not because you became intimidating, but because you became harder to read. Reading is how people test limits safely. When they can't read you, they slow down. This is also where people around you reveal themselves without trying. Those who relied on your explanations to maintain comfort feel unsettled. They press for reassurance. They probe for alignment. They try to pull you back into the familiar role. And you don't refuse them. You simply don't move. Others respond differently. They adapt. They meet you where you are. They recalibrate without friction. That contrast is important, because it shows you something you were never meant to see clearly while you were over-explaining. Who benefited from your accessibility? Once the rule is installed, you stop managing these reactions. You don't correct them. You don't soothe them. You don't weaponize them. You observe. And observation reinforces the rule further, because you see the pattern stabilize without your intervention. This is why power dynamics flip quietly and stay flipped, not because someone asserted dominance, but because someone stopped absorbing pressure that wasn't theirs. The hierarchy doesn't need enforcement once responsibility is redistributed. And the redistribution only happens when you stop stepping in to rescue shared meaning. At that point, the behavior becomes automatic. You're not remembering to stay silent. You're not reminding yourself to hold back. You simply don't feel the impulse anymore. That's when the rule stops being a tactic and becomes a position. A position that doesn't announce itself, doesn't explain itself, doesn't correct misconceptions unless they interfere with outcomes. Everything else is allowed to exist without your involvement. That's what makes it permanent. At this stage, nothing feels dramatic anymore. There's no sensation of winning, no internal signal that something has been achieved. The absence of strain is the only marker, and even that fades quickly. Because when a dynamic truly flips, it stops being something you monitor. It becomes the background condition. You're no longer tracking reactions. You're no longer adjusting delivery. You're no longer calculating how things landed. Not because you stopped caring, but because caring stopped being required. The environment reorganizes itself around that absence. This is the part most people never reach, even if they understand everything intellectually. They keep a subtle attachment to outcome, a quiet need for confirmation that the shift is real. So they watch, they measure, they check for signs, and that checking is the last thread of involvement. When that thread remains, the dynamic never fully settles. It stays slightly unstable, slightly reactive, slightly reversible. True power dynamics don't feel sharp. They feel dull, uneventful, predictable in the best way. Not because you're predictable, but because others are. Once you stop managing meaning, People reveal how they operate when left alone with their interpretations. Some stabilize themselves quickly, others grow cautious, a few grow restless. But none of that requires your response. That's the difference. Before, every reaction felt like a cue, something to answer, something to address, something to fix. Now, reactions are just reactions. They rise and fall without pulling you into them. This is where the hierarchy locks, not through distance, not through coldness, but through non-engagement with unnecessary friction. You don't become less human. You become less available to roles you never agreed to play. And those roles were always the drain: explainer, reassurer, clarifier, translator of yourself. Once those roles disappear, there's nothing left to negotiate. People either align or they don't. They either adjust or they drift. They either meet the new condition or they remain where they are. You don't categorize them. You don't label them. You don't analyze their behavior. You simply stop stepping into the space between intention and interpretation. That space used to feel like responsibility. Now it feels like interference. And without that interference, systems settle. What's left is not dominance, it's not intimidation, it's not control, it's positioning. Positioning doesn't announce itself, it doesn't require maintenance, it doesn't need reinforcement through behavior. It's defined by what no longer happens. No rushing, no smoothing, no preemptive explanation, no reflexive correction, just clean interaction. This is also why the final stage feels almost invisible from the inside. You don't wake up thinking about power. You don't enter rooms with strategy. You respond when response is required. You speak when speech has consequence. You clarify only when ambiguity carries cost. Everything else is left alone. That restraint doesn't make you distant. It makes you precise. And precision changes how others move. They approach more deliberately. They test less casually. They commit more clearly or not at all, because ambiguity now belongs to them, not you. This is the end of the dynamic, not because it's resolved, but because it no longer demands energy. There's nothing to flip anymore. Once the behavior that fed the imbalance is gone, the imbalance has no mechanism to return, not unless you reintroduce it. And that's why this isn't something you use. It's something you stop undoing. You don't remember it in moments of stress. You don't summon it under pressure. It's already there. Silence, where silence belongs. Speech, where speech matters. Distance, where distance stabilizes. No explanation, no justification, no performance, just position. And from that position, nothing needs to be said. Not even this.